A single key glinted in the torchlight, small enough to hide in a palm, yet powerful enough to control a life. Behind the iron clasp of a heavy belt, fastened with locks and legend, a woman's body became a battleground of faith, fear, and profit. The air in the chamber smelled of oil and iron. Outside, monks preached purity. Inside, merchants counted coins. It was the age when virtue could be bought, shame could be forged, and metal itself became morality. For centuries, the chastity belt has haunted imagination, a cruel device of locks and blades said to guard honor and punish desire. But what if the real horror wasn't the iron, but the industry that grew around it? What if the story of the belt was not just about control, but about money, the currency of fear that flowed through Europe's most virtuous hands? The story begins not with lust, but with fear. Europe in the Middle Ages was an anxious continent, terrified of sin, obsessed with control. The Black Death had thinned populations, crusades had bloodied faith, and the church's grip over daily life had become both spiritual and commercial. Purity was currency, and purity, as always, was demanded most of women. By the end of the story, you will see that the chastity belt, whether real, imagined, or reinvented, was never about morality alone. It was about ownership, of bodies, of wealth, and of fear itself. Beneath the legend lies a profitable machinery that turned shame into gold, and obedience into an economy. To understand the chastity belt, one must first understand medieval obsession with control. In a world where disease struck without warning and kingdoms fell overnight, people sought order through the only realm they could govern, morality. The church taught that sin entered through the flesh. Therefore, to restrain the flesh was to resist the devil. Women, as the bearers of lineage and temptation, became the focus of this holy paranoia. Manuals of confession listed unchaste thought as a mortal danger. Preachers compared the female body to a city whose gates must be guarded from invaders. The metaphor would become literal soon enough. Yet the earliest references to chastity belts are not punishments, they are symbols. Italian poets of the 12th century jested about lovers who locked away their faithless wives while traveling. These were jokes, metaphors of jealousy, not engineering plans. But jokes have a way of growing teeth. As crusaders departed eastward, leaving wives behind, gossip mixed with metal. By the 15th century, inventories in Florence and Venice mentioned cingulum castitatis, belts of chastity, not as standard apparel, but as curiosities displayed among armor and relics. The belts that survive today, in museums and dusty vaults, are anachronisms. Most date to the 18th or 19th centuries, when fascination with medieval cruelty reached fever pitch. Yet even if few were worn, the idea of the belt had already taken root in the medieval mind. It was the perfect myth, combining faith, fear, and the illusion of safety. Iron was heavy, but belief was heavier still. The real engine behind the chastity belt myth was not theology. It was commerce. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe's cities had become marketplaces of morality. Metalworkers crafted reliquaries for saints and armor for soldiers, and between them, curiosities for nobles obsessed with control. Among these novelties were imitation belts, iron frames lined with velvet or silk, engraved with prayers. Some were bought as jokes, others as wedding gifts. But all carried the same silent message: the female body was property to be guarded. As the Reformation fractured Christendom, moral competition replaced crusades. Catholics and Protestants alike weaponized virtue as propaganda. Pamphlets warned of fallen women, and artists painted allegories of female temptation chained by reason. In this theater of fear, the chastity belt became emblem, metaphor, and museum piece all at once, proof that purity could be enforced. Merchants saw opportunity. The trade in locks, bolts, and personal safekeeping devices boomed. Manuals promised instruments of faith and fidelity. Yet these were not meant for peasants. They were luxury goods, purchased by the wealthy who feared scandal more than sin. The belt became less an object of punishment than a display of dominance, proof of power, not piety. But the most chilling part of this story is not whether the belts existed, but who profited from the idea of them. Fear itself became a marketable commodity. Metalworkers sold to jealous husbands. Preachers sold indulgences to anxious wives. Writers sold tales of honor defended by locks. The myth was the product, and Europe bought it eagerly. By the late Renaissance, the chastity belt had become a mirror reflecting everything society wished to hide: its hypocrisy, its greed, and its terror of female autonomy. The Enlightenment arrived promising reason, yet superstition adapted. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as Europe industrialized, factories began producing antique chastity belts for collectors and moral reformers. Museums exhibited them beside instruments of torture, labeled as authentic relics of medieval virtue. but most were fabrications, products of a booming fascination with the macabre past. At the same time, a new fear was rising, the fear of freedom. As women began inheriting property and entering professions, conservative reformers rebranded the chastity belt as a symbol of lost discipline. Victorian pamphlets claimed it had once kept society pure, lamenting its absence as moral decay. The irony was grim. A device that may never have existed became proof of a morality that never was. Behind the scenes, the profit continued. Locksmiths and manufacturers marketed modern chastity devices, small, intricate locks sold to parents terrified of youthful desire. Some were made of brass, some padded with leather, and many advertised through whispers in private catalogs. The myth of purity had become a business model, and its customers were not lords but ordinary families. The imagery of the belt also seeped into literature and art. Painters and writers used it as shorthand for repression, warning that civilization's obsession with control was itself a form of madness. The belt, they argued, symbolized an age willing to sacrifice humanity for order. An iron age masquerading as holy. It was no longer about metal, but memory, a story forged in fear and sold for centuries. By the early 20th century, scholars began to question the authenticity of the belts displayed across Europe. In 1904, German historian Albert Dolman declared most were later inventions. Others followed, tracing their origins to the forgeries of 19th-century curiosity dealers. The evidence was clear. The majority of medieval chastity belts had never touched human skin. Yet the legend endured. It thrived in pulp magazines, early films, and the collective imagination. Why? Because myths that justify control are far harder to kill than iron. The chastity belt became a metaphor for the policing of morality, a relic of how easily fear can be monetized. Even now, its shadow stretches long. The same logic, that purity equals control, that women's safety requires restriction, continues in subtler forms in laws and expectations, in industries that promise protection while selling submission. The belt's ghost remains not in museums, but in every system that profits from fear disguised as virtue. And so, what began as a rumor, sharpened by greed and sanctified by superstition, became one of history's most enduring lies, that chastity was ever about faith, when it was always about power. The chastity belt was never just an object. It was a story, one forged in fire, tempered by fear, and sold as salvation. Its legend tells us less about desire than about domination, less about faith than about the profit of shame. Every lock has a key, but the hardest to turn is the one forged in belief. When the iron rusted, the myth remained, because societies built on fear need their relics. And perhaps the most terrifying truth is not who wore the belt, but who made it, and who still makes its modern heirs. Next episode, the price of virtue. How medieval confession became the world's first surveillance system.